Welcome back to the Locked and Loaded. No, it's not the Locked and Loaded. It's the No Risk, No Reward podcast here on YouTube. That's just programming on my part because I used to host a talk radio show on a radio station called TNT. It was called Locked and Loaded, and that's actually where I made contact with the lovely lady that I'm about to speak with today, none other than Karen Hunt. And let me just get straight into it today. Karen is, I believe, if you could sum her up, an adventurer, a writer, a fighter, and a believer. And we're going to take some time today just to delve into her past and see what she's all about and how she's arrived at the point she's at today. So Karen, thank you very much for joining me here today. And I hope this won't be too traumatic for you.
It's fantastic. I love talking to you. It's not our first conversation that we've ever had. And I love your introduction. I just might steal that from you. Kind of
well, feel free.
Things
it's about you. And one of the things that I've tried to do, or I'm trying to do with this, I'm trying to keep politics, geopolitics, economics, everything out of it. I want it to be about people and their stories rather than the things they write about or the things that they're passionate about in the real world, just to try and get through to the roots of people and what they're about. So if you're enjoying these little clips or these shows so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, follow, do whatever you need to do, share the content, like it, and hit the notification bell so you'll be updated on what is coming next. So I'm going to start off, Karen, reading something that you've written to set the scene, and then I want you to turn on after I finished reading this. So these are your words that I'm reading back to you. I grew up in a conservative Christian family. In the 1980s, my dad became an influential Christian author, selling over 4 million books. The road to that goal was long and hard. It all started on a night in 1966 when my dad gathered our family of 6 in his study and made an announcement that would change our lives forever. Good old dad, eh? Good old dad. Dad told us that God had spoken to him. He was to give up his successful business career and become a writer. God said this, remember? With the fire of faith and fervor in his eyes, he said we were going to travel the world and go where God led us so he could gain inspiration for his books. So that's the opening statement. And I want to hit the rewind button in your life. I want you to go back to that night in 1966. I'm sure you can still remember it vividly. What was going through your mind when your dad made that announcement to the Hunt family?
Yeah, so that moment in time set a course for my life. I think for all of us, the 6 people in our family. And my father was very much the patriarch of the family. He was very much the head of the family, and we all respected him very much. He was really a wonderful man who really followed his faith. So it wasn't like somebody came up with some crazy idea one night that went against everything that we knew about him. This was who my father was, a very devout Christian who actually really did listen to God's voice. And just to give you a little background, I grew up in the Plymouth Brethren Church. My mother was a Mennonite who could trace her family back, to the 1600s or something, so this was my history. And every night and every morning we would pray and read the Bible, and we went, to our little church, although we called it meeting. So this was how our life was. So when my father said this, it was a huge, big thing because I was 10 years old at the time. So that tells you how ancient I am. But it was sort of like, I just accepted what he said. And I don't think of course, none of us realized the implications. I sensed from my mother a little bit of concern about what my father was doing, but she always 100% supported him in whatever he said or did. And so it was just this moment where suddenly our lives changed in that moment. And my dad, in fact, he opened the Bible and he looked at a verse that said, "Go ye into all the world." He actually did this. And he said, and he looked at all of us and he said, "And that's what we're going to do." And so we put up our house. We were living in a beautiful suburb of Los Angeles. We put up our house that my parents had built for rent. And about, I think maybe, I don't know how many months later, but it took us a little while. With our 6 suitcases, we got on a plane for London. We had no plan of where we were going to go. We just knew we were going to land in London. We had, my father and mother had some friends in various places. And that started our journey. And we started traveling where the Lord would lead us. And from there, we had, excuse me, many incredible adventures. I can, speak about some of them. And one of the things was, I think for me, growing up as a Christian, one of the things that you learn is that you should be separate from the world. You're in the world, but you should be separate from it. And I've been writing this story of what happened, and to me, it was sort of like, I called it Into the World, because we were going into the world, and yet we were not a part of the world. So we went all over the place. We actually ended up, smuggling Bibles into Romania. We can talk about that if you wish. We ended up living in one floor of a 17th century castle in Switzerland, us going to the village school, where we were treated like aliens, basically, at that time. We went throughout the entire, all the Iron Curtain countries, saw many miracles. It was quite amazing. And we actually were in Egypt right days before the 6-Day War, and actually barely made it out, escaping through Syria before the borders were closed. So those are just some of the adventures that we had.
So it was a roller coaster, obviously, because at the time, back in '66, you said you were 10 years of age. And just from that initial statement that I read out, that your dad had been a successful businessman, you were living in a nice suburb of LA. Your parents had built that house together. I take it, was your life completely settled at that point? In other words, you weren't itinerants moving around America. You were fixed in LA. You grew up in LA, and LA was all you had known until you were 10 years of age. Is that correct?
Yeah, we went on some little trips around, but yeah, I never been on an airplane. Um, my father had a very excellent job. Every year we got a brand new station wagon. We were very much a part of the community. My father was very respected in the Christian community. People thought he was quite crazy, but my whole life, people have thought my dad was crazy. I realize now he did a lot of he never ever marched to anybody else's drum. He was very, very, very brave person, and stood up against a lot of adversity during his life. Over the years, we actually lost everything, for him, having this faith and believing he should become a writer. And then he became very successful at it. But that was really never, his goal was always to do what God told him to do, despite everything. And I remember that plane ride, that first plane ride that we took. I don't know, it was on TWA or Pan Am, back then. And there were a lot of people on the plane that were partying. They all got drunk. And I'm thinking, and there's never any alcohol in my house. And I can tell you, literally, not an exaggeration, I never heard a swear word in my house. So that was my first introduction of going basically into the world, And I thought, God's gonna strike this plane. We're all gonna go down like these heathens on the plane. I was so completely didn't know anything about that sort of a life, that there's all these other crazy people in the world that are just going to go out and party and have a good time. We were on a mission, and so it was very much quite the introduction. But amazingly, the plane, we made it to our destination.
Imagine that. Imagine that. You see, the thing
Yeah.
is, too, do you not find as a believer, and I'm speaking as an evangelical Christian myself, just a little bit of personal information, that when you think the people that you've described, the people that are necking the alcohol, the people that are swearing like troopers, those are the people that God is most interested in. He's not interested in the righteous. He's not interested in the happy clappers and the holy rollers. He's more interested in the people that need a little bit of help and that need to be delivered from certain things that are destroying their lives. But again, is that not just something that you learn over time? Yeah, this was almost like your baptism of fire, going into this behind your dad as a 10-year-old, taken out of your comfort zone in LA. All of a sudden, you're on this airplane heading towards London. Probably your head was spinning at that stage, wondering, well, what's waiting for us when we get there? And how are we going to live day to day? What about my friends back home in LA? What about school? Were those sort of things rolling around in your head? Excited on one hand, but also a little bit apprehensive on the other?
Yeah, I had to leave my friends. I had to say goodbye to my best friend Kelly. She's still my best friend to this day. And so we landed in London. We stayed in, it was what was it called? Something court. It was just like a really like seedy part of London, but
Mm-hmm.
we didn't know that when we got there. We stayed in some like horrid little hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you this, like, and then we got a VW van, which was actually a miracle how we got this van. I won't go into that whole story, but anyway, we managed to buy this VW van, bright red VW van, and then the first thing that really stuck in my mind was going out to the country. It was the Cotswolds, to these friends of my parents, this British man and woman, Hillary and Noel. They were wonderful, wonderful people. Actually, Noel, he prayed for me my entire life. This man, he just sort of took me on as a cause because I needed a lot of prayer at a certain point in my life. But anyway, went to their home and it was this thatched house, and it was like from the first moment, I loved that traveling. My younger brother, he came back and vowed he would never leave the United States again, and he never did. But the rest of it, he was the only one that felt like that. But the rest of us loved it. So I really just, I loved this adventure. I really, really did. From the moment we landed and everything, it was just like this amazing, incredible world to me that I was discovering. And in that thatched cottage, on one rainy day, my sister and I, because there's a lot of rainy days, as you know, we went into the sort of the study, and there's this fire, and in the hearth, and all these books on the shelf. And my sister and I, we take down these books that look interesting, and it's the Narnia Chronicles, The
Mm-hmm.
Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we sit in these great big overstuffed chairs and start reading these books. And that was when I first fell in love with stories and
Mm-hmm.
books. I mean, my parents had read to us a lot. I loved books already, but at that moment, entering that world of magic and all of that. And so I remember, I mean, what could be better reading those books, right, than in this old thatched English countryside home? And then when we went to, we crossed over to France, and all the places that we stayed in had these big old wardrobes,
Mm-hmm.
And so my sister and I, we were like, oh, wardrobes. There's no wardrobes in the United States. And so we were like, they actually, there's a wardrobe. And so we would
Which one's
run
the
up.
portal? Which
Yeah,
one's the
exactly.
portal to
So
Narnia?
so we would like go approach the wardrobe, and then like, surely maybe this is the one that will take us to the magical world. We'd open the wardrobe, and so we would go through this whole thing. We'd never found that wardrobe, but that was sort of kind of my sister and I. She was 2 years older than me, so we both had amazingly overdeveloped imaginations. And so we had a lot of wonderful adventures like that.
So it was really something that was nurtured in you. You already had a sense of wonderment and imagination, but this almost stuck it onto steroids whenever your dad took you adventuring around the world. And I keep focusing in on your age at 10 because when you look at the world at 10, it looks vastly different when you're 20 and then 30 and 40 and 50 and 60. It keeps evolving. I think every decade that you get older, you view and perceive the world differently. You talked about as well sitting in the big chairs, reading those books, getting a sense of wonderment in there too. I want to ask you about because when you said your dad was called, and I'm using your words again, dad told us God had spoken to him. He was to give up a successful business career and become a writer. Now, that's unusual in that I've heard a lot of stories and been to various missionary conferences where people have said, God called me to go to India to minister to the sick, or to build a hospital, or to try and help with education, or to preach the gospel, or to go into prisons, or do radio evangelism. That's the first time that I've seen a testimony to say that your dad felt that he was called to be a writer, not a preacher or a healer or whatever, the things that you would normally associate with evangelical Christianity, but to be a writer. That was a little bit odd too. Were you expecting him almost to, don a sackcloth and ashes and be ringing a bell and telling the people to repent? Or were you saying, well, he's sitting at a typewriter or he's jotting furiously all the time? Was that a little bit unusual for you too?
That's a good question. I don't know that it was because he still always was writing. He was already preaching a lot, speaking a
Mhm.
lot. He was an incredibly wonderful speaker, public speaker. And he loved books. So we were always reading. He would always recite poetry to us, things like that. I knew that he wanted to write. I knew and I mean, later, I mean, I didn't know all these things then, but he was very unhappy. He was a mathematician. That was he was actually a CPA. So
What's a
he had also,
CPA? I don't know what a
so
CPA
it's
is.
somebody that like he did the taxes and the finances for a very like big
Like an
firm
accountant. He
that,
was a
yes,
chartered
like,
accountant.
yes, like that. So he was sort of in charge of the finances of, these big companies. And and so he had a very analytical mind. Besides being a very artistic person, he had a very analytical mind. So he really enjoyed that side of it. Like he enjoyed arguments, debates, things like that. So when we started traveling, his goal was to meet people, to become inspired, and we met the most incredible people, and one of the things that I began to wonder about during that time was, as a Christian, that's all, that's the answer. As you become a Christian, and you follow, you ask Jesus into your heart, you become a Christian, and that's the way to heaven. But we also met many people during that trip who were not Christians, who were wonderful people,
Hmm.
And I remember, so when as one example, when we were in Egypt, um, we arrived there like days, we didn't know this was going to happen, of course, but days before the Six-Day War, 1967, I actually celebrated my 11th birthday in Ankara, Turkey. So we arrive into Cairo, and there's people in the streets, with guns, man, crowds in the streets. I think Cairo is the most chaotic city in the world.
Hmm.
I don't think you can find a more chaotic one than Cairo, but a wonderful city. And in loudspeakers, there's Nassar's voice screaming on these loudspeakers, death to America and its stooge, Israel. And we're there in this bright, and we realize like there's no other tourists here. We're like the only people here. And we're in this bright red van with a big USA sticker that we were obligated to have on the back
Yeah.
window. And we're all like, well, I was 10 years old, but my parents are very tall. We're a tall family,
Mhm.
very tall people, you know. And so we traveled down the Nile we got out of Cairo and we went down to Luxor. And I lived there later in life, so this all sort of relates. So we'll talk about that later, perhaps. But so we go down to Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, the Nile, and I just fell in love with Luxor. It was like it was something out of the Arabian Nights, books that I read. And we sailed on the Nile with this Nubian sailor in his boat, in his felucca. And I had a little conversation with him.
Mhm.
And he told me this wonderful, wonderful story. Like with his, he could speak English pretty quite well. And he told me this wonderful story about the ancient, gods and all this kind of stuff. And he said that he was, how he loved Allah and all of
Mhm.
this. And so I took all of this into my heart, because I was a very, very questioning person from a young age. I just have a very, very inquiring mind. I can't stop it. So that night we were actually staying in the Winter Palace, which is this incredible hotel. And because there was nobody, like we didn't have my parents were being very careful with their funds. So we didn't, so it wasn't like we were staying. Sometimes we slept by the side of the road if we couldn't find a hotel, or a motel. But we happened to be able to stay there because there's nobody else there. So they gave us a really good rate. It was so hot. We pulled mattresses out onto the balcony, and I'm there, look, the moon is rising
Mhm.
above Luxor Temple. The wild dogs
Mhm.
howling across the Nile. And I asked my dad, I said, how can it be that nobody else is right and we're right and they're all wrong, because this man was so faith, like he seemed like there be people who are as good as we are? I'm sure that there are, and there are Christians that are not very good people, you know.
Yeah, I
So it
know, right?
really yeah, so those questions really haunted me
Mhm.
from a young age. And and my dad, he just said, if your spirit, whoever is inquiring will find
Mhm.
the answer, and they will come. And but still, at the end of the day, Jesus is the way, that
Mhm.
Jesus is the way, and not through Allah. And he was really adamant about that, about the religion of Islam, and all of that. And so I didn't quite agree with him at that point, but because I didn't understand really what he was saying, and it didn't seem fair to me, so we had to go back to Cairo, and we went back to Cairo, and we were trying to get to Israel, because that was like the height of everything. My parents, and
Mhm.
particularly my father, wanted to get to Israel. So we go to the things are getting worse and worse, more and more unrest, and we go into sort of the tourist agency. And my dad says to the guy, "We want to go to Israel," and he stands up and he screams at my dad, "Israel does not exist." And my dad, being the person that he is, had to respond in a calm but very firm voice, "Yes, it does." And the man said, and he screamed again, "No, it doesn't." And forever on this trip, I can tell you, we were all like, "Oh no, there he goes again.
Mhm.
He can't, why can't my dad ever just be quiet?
Yeah.
Why does he have to get us in these situations?" But eventually we had no choice. We could not get to Israel. And we crossed over to Beirut, which was a beautiful city at that time. It's so sad what's happened. And we were there trying to figure out how to get out. And eventually we got out through, we had to drive through the mountains. We got out through Syria into Turkey 36 hours before they closed the borders.
Mhm.
And we found out later, because of course back then there was no, internet, nothing like that. But we found out later that another American with a car, American car, had been blown up in during that, after that somebody that hadn't gotten out. But I remember crossing over that border from Syria, and men in the villages with, like, they had bayonets, with the sharp, and they were in the villages. And we crossed over, and this was the thing about borders that I discovered during that time, and it made me really fascinated by borders, and the way people separate one another, which really affected the work that I did in my life later on. The minute we crossed into Turkey, it was like we felt uplifted in our spirits. You knew when you crossed into a place where you were safer. And I remember the first village that we came to there, all the people surrounded us, and they were like, "Oh, America, America," and we just like, you step across from one foot, one place to another, and it's like the whole world changes.
Yeah.
And my dad, I remember thinking, "Oh man, I could, if only we could speak, I could get up on the roof and I could preach here," and so that was a very, very, like, these experiences, you can see they greatly
Well,
influenced
yeah.
my life,
And they've
so.
been burned. It's almost like they've been, well, experiences like that, not a lot of people get to experience, and let alone at a young age. And you know what it's like when you're young and you've got a formative mind. These things maybe are even more impactful on a child's mind than they
Absolutely.
even are on an adult's. Can I ask you this, actually, because I want to look at life on the road, because I want to try and cover different aspects of what you've just said, or some of it, okay, in terms of day to day life. So, one of the things, well, Christians, I believe, have a perception of how things will go when they become believers. They think maybe, okay, if I'm sick, I'm going to get healed. If I'm broke, I'm going to be looked after. I'm not going to have any problems in my life. I'm not going to be dealing with addictions or evil thoughts or temptations. Everything's wonderful, happy, clappy. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Yes, he does, but that does not give you a pass from going through the valley of the shadow of death. Okay. And even if you are going through it, he's going through it with you, granted. But at the time, it can be a little bit traumatic. So, what I want to ask you is, going from the lifestyle of pretty much safety and abundance and provision, which was what your dad was doing with his accountancy job in Los Angeles, to going to life on the road. Because I'm thinking of little things that you said there about managing the funds. Some days we stayed in a hotel, some days we were on a mattress at the side of the road, or we were sleeping on a veranda and we didn't have that money. Another perception is that, well, when people go out and do God's work, they're going to be dripping in it. You see all these evangelical preachers on TV with their Gulfstream jets and their mega churches, and the money's coming in hand over fist. But the guys and the girls and the women and the men that are out there in the field getting their hands and feet dirty in these far-flung places like Luxor don't seem to have the same level of prosperity than those in the large American mega churches with their own television ministries. So, and you also mentioned, so I'm paraphrasing what you said, and then I want to get you to respond to it. So you also said that you went from a position of wealth with your dad's old job, then he answered the call, he was faithful, he went out into the world, he started to write. Initially, everything was lost before he started to gain traction, and literally sold millions of books. And I was trying to find it here, but I bought one of your dad's books when I was in my early 20s, a long time ago, about 30 years ago now. It was a book on cults and the occult. And, I kept it, passed it on to my daughter. She's now read it. I was looking for it tonight to hold it up the screen, but I couldn't put my hands on it. So he did become a very influential writer. And I mean, like, I live in Northern Ireland, and I never knew one day I would end up speaking with you, his daughter. But I mean, like, I bought his books and I've passed them on and told people about them and shared about your father without knowing who he was. So he had a wide reach. But what was it like whenever maybe the funds started to dry up, or you did lose everything? Because that can rattle the cage, and that can, all of a sudden, the bubble bursts, and you're thinking, well, I didn't think it was going to be like this. When are we going home, Dad? When are you going to kick your accountancy job back, Dad? When are we going back to that nice little cushy suburb of LA? Did you ever get to that position, or did you not talk about it?
The funny thing about me is that I think that I take after my dad a lot. I've realized that. And I think that's why he and I had a lot of conflicts over our life too. We did clash a lot later on when I got older, but that was never the case. It took a while for for things to go get really challenging, shall we say. It wasn't like that in the beginning. And he was responsible. He did things like he bought a convalescent hospital that he thought would, but things happened and God's plan, where nothing went well with all of that. And we did end up, when I was a teenager, and we went back to the United States. We also went back, and then we traveled again. So it wasn't like we were always, on the road. We did go back. But my father actually spoke out against those prosperity preachers. He just tore into them. They did not like him very much. And my parents, I said my mom was a Mennonite. I learned from my parents that if you are a Christian, you will be hated. You will be despised. You will, if you have like millions or billions of dollars, that's not following Jesus. Even when my father became very successful, he gave away. He helped people who were needy. He would go to, later on when he was well off, he would go to the Soviet Union or Russia or anywhere and sleep on a pastor's sofa. He never asked for a fee. He just said, whatever you can give, and God blessed him, but he never wanted to have like, they lived very simply, my parents, no matter what. They lived a simple, faithful life. And so that's what I learned. And I believe that myself. Like, I have lived that life myself, because it's just something that I think that I just was never that impressed with. I've been around a lot of people with a lot of money, a lot of success, and I see that they are not happy people in their souls a lot of times, so that is not what brings you happiness. And I've seen everything, trust me. So that, when we were on the road, we would pray, and my parents would say, like, for example, I'm a very competitive person. You know, I do these sports and I did martial arts and boxing and all of that. And my father would say, when you run a race, it's not always the person who wins that really wins, because that person who wins the race, maybe they have all the attributes already to do that. But it can be, you know, think about the person who comes in last but never gave up, maybe who had, you know, who has some sort of physical condition that impedes that person's progress. But no matter what, they keep going. And that's what I learned in my life. No matter what, you keep going. You know what's right. Everybody can be against you. I'll give you another example. We were on a we were on a ferry. I don't remember. I think it was somewhere in from Norway, or you know, somewhere in Scandinavia. We were on a ferry, and it came to the place where we should get off the ferry. And perhaps everybody was on autopilot. Maybe it had been this way other times, but they all started going towards this one exit. And my dad he was the only person who said, that's not the right way. Let's go this way. And he turned around, and we're going against the crowds, you know, to go the opposite direction. And eventually everybody started looking and saying, oh yeah, you know, and of course I'm thinking again, why are we doing this? You know, but, and not that he was always right. He wasn't always right, but I'm just giving you examples. So that was, you know, and these things stuck in my head as that just because somebody says, or just because everybody around you is saying, yeah, this is right, you want to do this, you have to reach your own conclusion in your life. Reach your own conclusion. There's no excuse for not reaching your own conclusion.
Yeah, because even the things that we're talking about, we share a lot of the same beliefs. I would imagine you can never get two people together that have exactly the same beliefs, but that's just the path that you that you went on, that led you to where you're at now. I've had my path that's led me to where I'm at now, but I'm past, you know, caring anymore about what people perceive me as. Say, oh, you're crazy, you're this, you're that, you're the other, you're narrow-minded. I don't mind if people think that about me, and I've got to the point now where I just respect people's. If your opinion is wildly different than mine, I'll respect it. I won't necessarily agree with it, but I'll respect it, and I would expect that same level of respect back. And if that was the case, I think the world would be a more chilled out place. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would certainly be more chilled out. I want to now zone in on the writing, because I wanted to get a taste of your background and maybe what was instilled in you from an early age in terms of writing. Because when I first encountered yourself, it was predominantly as a very prolific, eloquent, voracious writer. All right, you were always writing, pieces. It seemed to consume you. Okay, so I'm getting back to the origins of that, and I suppose I would say, because you touched on the wonderment you had when you were a kid up in the Cotswolds, sitting in these big chairs reading C.S. Lewis, and you know, this imagination, this active imagination of yours was there. Let me ask you, when did you start putting that on paper? Was there a delay there? And your dad as well, so he was out and about, moving around with the family. Was he a very prolific writer? Did he have time set aside every day? He decided on a project. He said, right, from 11 a.m. until 3 p.m. I'm going to write, and then I'm going to do some in the afternoon. What was his schedule? And did that influence you or encourage you to pick up the pen or the typewriter when you saw your dad doing it, because you were only 10 back then?
Well, I have to go a little bit further back to when I was very young, maybe 5 years old, where the first and foremost thing that I am is an artist. So ever since I could pick up a pencil or pen, I was drawing, and I was obsessive about that. I could spend hours in my room drawing. And then I found out that the things that inspired me for my art were often things that were written. So I did actually end up later in life. I actually have 19 children's books that I've written and illustrated that have been published under a name, well, under a couple different names. But you can find them, but they're all out of print now. But they were, well, very successful at a certain point. So that's where I started. children's books, children's stories. I loved that. My father, it's not like he had a schedule. He was just always, he was just driven. He was a person that was driven. So either he was writing in his study or whatever, or he was out speaking. And my mom, I don't know what he would have done without her, because she was also his editor. My mom has 2 books published as well. She's a very wonderful writer, and so she would do editing for him, and she helped him a lot. Um, and but he was, and even at a certain point when I was a teenager, we were living in France at the foot of the Jura Mountains. I was like stuck up on this mountain my last year of high school, did it by correspondence course. And so I started typing his stuff for him. So he taught me the computer, actually. He taught me the computer, and he taught me how to type and all of that. And so I would, he would pay me and I would type his writing for him. And we had a lot of conversations about that. So I always thought, actually, my sister, she was more the writer. I never thought that I was going to be a writer. I thought I'm an artist. And but eventually, and in fact, I never thought I would be doing what I'm doing now with all of this writing. If you had told me that even, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, I would never have thought that I would be doing this, because I did all these children's books, and then I actually have a novel published, a sci-fi novel called Luminaria, and I have a YA series for young adults of a fantasy series that's been published. So, and then I did all these other things, like started this creative writing program. So it was really much later in my life, which is kind of like, I guess, same thing with my father, that I really started focusing and devoting myself to the writing. And I think I realized at a certain point, I did these children's books, that I had something more to say than that, and I wanted to get it out there. So that's, and then I mean, for me, I'm a very self-motivated, the same like my father. So self-motivated person. Everything that I've done, everything that I've achieved has been because I thought up that idea and I did it, So that's basically, and in order to do that, you have to be very disciplined, and you have to, yes, sit down every day, and you have to do it, basically do it. You just do it.
Okay. Again, a little rewind there, because something's just flashed into my head that's very relevant in the time and age that we're in at the minute. Maybe it wasn't such a big thing back in the 60s, 1966, and the early 70s, where, you got your education on the road or on the hoof, or as you said there, you finished your last year by correspondence to get your quote education. A lot of people these days would say, well, schools are no more now than indoctrination centers. There's kids that are being brought in there, and they're being taught a certain narrative, a state-sponsored narrative, whichever way you want to look at it. The education system has changed radically over the last few decades. Nowadays, a lot more parents these days are actively considering, or have brought their children out of state education or even out of private education, just to teach them and educate them themselves. And that's, I don't want to say it's something that's looked upon as taboo, but it's always something that's looked upon a little bit strange. So if you said, well, I'm homeschooling my children, or my children don't go to school, cult, they must be in a cult. What are they? They're a hippie cult, or what are they? But it's not necessarily the case. And I think maybe for somebody that's listening to this conversation here today, maybe this is completely off the wall, by the way, but maybe someone's going, well, I'm not happy with my son or daughter's school, or my children's school, or my grandchildren's school, and I wish there was something that I could do. Is it possible? And it's really difficult, and they can't possibly succeed. I suppose you're living proof that you don't need a traditional education to be, a highly prolific and successful writer, illustrator, artist, traveler, call it whatever you like. You don't need that. And I suppose I could hold you up as living proof of that in some way. I suppose I know you've got your faults too. We don't want to go into them today. But what I'm saying is, you don't need to follow the traditional routes like your dad. You don't have to tread the broad path like everybody else. There are alternatives out there, and they can be just as fruitful and successful if you're prepared to take that chance.
Yeah, it takes a little bit, but it also takes a certain type of person, I think,
Mhm,
because it's not easy to go against the tide or the
mhm,
grain. But I think yes, a lot more people are definitely choosing, I know in the United States, to go the route of homeschooling. Also, I think it's great but schools are horrible places. I never actually liked school very much. You've got 2,000 children locked in a gated place with other kids, and then these very unhappy, unfulfilled, angry adults teaching them because they don't get paid enough, and and so it's really not a good environment for children should really be in more like smaller communities in their neighborhood. It would be great if families got together just in neighborhoods. They could hire a tutor or what have you to come in and teach, and then they could, it would be. I think that would be such a much better way to go with children. But that's not the case. That's not what we have. We have this sort of institutionalized way of raising children, and so yeah, I was taken out of that. I also did go to normal schools,
mhm.
but there was always the sense that you're there, but you're not, you should not, they're going to teach you things that we don't agree with, but that's okay because we know,
What we know.
and my parents, I think you have to be really involved in your
Mhm,
children's lives and in their education. I mean, I tried to do that with my kids as well, where you have to really know what's going on. I remember when I was like 9 years old, before we started this traveling, my dad burst into the school because what my teacher was teaching this was communism, and he did not want to go for that, and he was very, very adamant that that was wrong. So, but you have to know what's going on. And I think one of the things that parents have realized, is that they weren't paying enough attention to what was going on in the schools. And they are trying, at least in the United States, more conservative parents are trying to get more involved and insist, look, we are paying, we're paying for this. We're going to fight this battle.
mhm.
But it's very, very difficult, very difficult. So, yeah.
Again, that was just off the cuff a little bit when you mentioned your final year in correspondence. It's just something that's very heavy on my heart at the minute, is with
Mm-hmm.
seeing what my own daughter went through in the so-called state education system. And, not everybody has the same experience of it. Some people think it's the greatest thing ever, but other people, sometimes it's not so pleasant and not so good for the reasons that you've just outlined. And home education is a viable alternative, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to give up your job and become a full-time teacher. You can condense things a lot. You can learn on the hoof. You can move from school to school. There's a lot of options are available out there. So I suppose for anybody listening that's maybe scratching their heads or maybe feeling a little bit of despair with where their kids are at the minute, there are alternatives out there. It's not easy, but there are alternatives out there to that. We've been talking for 45 minutes. I told you before we started, I wanted to try and keep this to an hour. There are things that we aren't going to get talking about today that I really want to, but I want to give them justice. So maybe, in a few weeks or a month's time, you can come back and we can look at other specific projects that you've gotten into. But I want to finish off talking about writing itself, because there's a saying, and don't ask me to tell you who it's attributed to, but they say everybody has a book in them. Everybody has a book in them, and the graveyard's full of people that are lying there with great experiences, great ideas, great concepts, beautiful poetry that they had in them, but they never translated it onto paper or dictated it, or someone else sat and typed it out for them. Okay. And I'm dabbling a little bit at the minute. As you can probably gather, I'm a talker primarily. I could talk to the cows come home. I find it difficult to sit. I've got a short attention span and focus on something for any long period of time. I start things, I don't finish them. And I've got a few little projects on the go myself when it comes to writing, various forms of writing. And I'm noodling at them, I suppose you would say. I'm just noodling at them. But I think to get stuff done, number one, you mentioned discipline, and you mentioned focus on that. Noodling doesn't really do it, does it? You have to almost give yourself a proverbial kick up the backside and get serious and get disciplined about it, or else those little booklets and books of mine will also end up in the grave too someday, God forbid.
Yes, and I often have people come up to me and say, "Oh, I have a great story. Would you help me with it?" Or I have a great children's book, which, 35 pages of a few little sentences on each page. And I always say, "Oh, sure," because I know that 99.9% of the time they're never going to come back to me again with anything because it's just, "Oh, I have a great idea." It's very difficult to, in fact, anything in life, to be a self-starter, to take a blank page, to take nothing and then make something out of it. But what I always tell people is what I found when I first started writing was, and I tried writing when I was, 12, 13, 14 years old, and I'd write the first couple paragraphs and then you kind of fall in love with those first couple paragraphs, or you keep tweaking them and you keep changing them. And there's something about energy, your energy, how you dispel your energy, and you start losing your energy and you get stuck. So what I always say is you just keep going. Who cares if it's good or it's bad, when you start? Because you can always, the beauty of writing, it's not like painting a picture, or at least a watercolor, which is what I do. You do one little wrong thing and that's it. You have to start over. The beauty of writing is you can change whatever you want. It doesn't matter. So the important thing is to get to the end. You have to start and you have to know where you're going at a certain point. I don't make, when I write, even when I write a book, I don't make out, I've got everything in my head. So when I go to the market, I don't write a list. Everything's in my head. That's just how I am. Somebody else is different, so I somehow it all speaks to me and it comes together. Even the pieces that I write, the essays I write, long form essays on my, that's what I do now. And so, but it's the discipline of I don't have a certain time that I sit down. I just know that I'm doing this, but I'm driven to do it. Some people, they think, oh, I have an obligation. It's like going to the gym. I have an obligation. I should go to the gym, so it's not the same. And to write something, you don't have to write. Nobody has to write. So, it's a little more difficult to get yourself to do it, I think.
I suppose the people that I'm trying to aim this advice from you at are the people that are scratching their heads and they do have that desire or they do have that urge to do something in terms of the written word, but I'm too tired, it's been a long day, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. I suppose that apathy and the excuses are things that, of course, they're viable in many instances, but they shouldn't be a stumbling block or a barricade to you getting done what you need to get done. And also, in terms of time, again, I'm reading a lot of quotes from authors at the minute to try and inspire myself to keep at it. And, it doesn't take much for words to add up, even if you're only writing 300 words a day, which isn't much. It's only like a paragraph or two. That's 2,000 words a week if you do it 7 days a week, which is what, I don't know, 10,000 or 100,000 words a year. It doesn't take long for that to add up. And another thing, and you can tell me what you think of this, is that I found is it's when you read a book, that's the finished product. It's been meticulously crafted. It's been edited professionally. It's been edited by the author. Somebody's cast their eye over it, and then you're getting the final product in your hand. That's not what comes out of a writer. They almost have to dump everything on a page, and then at that point you start cutting large chunks out and go, you know what, that really sucks, I really don't like, what was I thinking? You edit it and that chunk becomes smaller, but you keep at it, you keep adding to it, because you can't edit nothing. If your page is blank, you can't edit that. If there's 10,000 words on it and 9,000 are awful, well, at least you're left with 1,000 good ones. Is that a fair mentality to take?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to, well, as you said, the self-discipline, you cannot just give yourself excuses. Okay, once or twice I'm too tired or whatever. But you really have to be disciplined because you'll get over that. Everything's a habit in life. So if your habit is to say, I'm too tired, that's what's going to happen. So you have to change that mentality. You have to change that habit, and that's where the discipline and the determination comes in. But also it can be very difficult if you are the kind of person that and you should just spill it all out on the page and get to the end, make it to the end. That's the most amazing feeling to me. And then you go back and you can start editing. But a lot of times we also then are, that's why sometimes you need an outside editor, because sometimes you fall in love with certain things that should really be cut out, and you just want to keep everything there, and that can be a problem too. So you have to be tough enough on yourself to, get rid of things that really don't need to be there, so that you can make the biggest impact with what you're having to say. Yeah.
And how important is it to write for you, first and foremost? How important is it not to try and second guess a market, or to try and write to what you think would be popular at the time, even if it turns out to be a literal disaster? Nobody's interested, nobody buys it. Is it should the focus always be that you're writing what you want to write about, you're writing what interests and provokes and stimulates you? If you're trying to second guess a market or a trend, you'll never really have any real passion for it. And when failure does come, it can be very brutal at that point. Whereas at least if you produce something to yourself and say, well, I'm happy with it, maybe nobody else got it, but I'm happy with it.
Yeah, I can say that, two things I can say about that. When I first started my writing, my break free, and I call it now break free media, I had people, I write long form essays. So I had people telling me, oh, nobody's ever going to read that. Nobody has the attention span to read that. You need to, do you want to be, they said to me, do you want to be an influencer? Or if you want to be an influencer, you need to cut it down, because people can't read past like 5 minutes, And I said, no, the last thing in the world I ever want to be is an influencer, number one. I want to do something that helps people start to think for themselves. Mm-hmm. I want to write something, maybe only a few people read what I'm writing, but if I can reach those few people to encourage them to think on a little bit deeper level, because all of these sound bites and quick, like speedy, like from, distracting, mind, destroying type of things that were being pushed at us continuously, this overstimulation is not making people smarter. It's not making them more informed. It's actually making them less able to think. They're just accepting things. So I started writing. I did what I wanted to do, and lo and behold, people really, really liked it. So and if they had it, even if I had a small audience, I don't have a huge audience, but whatever it is, I know that I'm doing what I believe is the right thing for me to do. So that's number one. The other thing is, when I was writing and illustrating children's books, I did a book, a George MacDonald book, The Lost Princess. George MacDonald was a Scottish writer who greatly influenced C.S. Lewis around the same time as C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And he had this wonderful story, The Lost Princess. So the publisher that I worked with, they told me, which I never should have done, but to edit, how can you edit George MacDonald? Anyway, make it shorter, it's too long. So I did some editing on it, and then I did the artwork for it. Well, that book was the worst book I ever did, and didn't sell hardly at all. It was a failure. The book was a failure. So, but a few years later, I got a letter from a principal of a school in New Jersey, and she said, I don't remember if she mailed me the book or asked for a book. I don't remember. But anyway, she said, could you please sign a copy of the book for our library? Because a girl, her sister died of cancer. Mm-hmm. And that was the book that got them through that, both of them through that experience, And so I thought about that, and I thought that book was a huge success, even if it only reached that one little girl, Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you measure success, first of all? How do you know what influence? And I only knew about that because she wrote me, so I have, so I think about it, I have 19 children's books. I have people talking, still contacting me, my Rumples and the Barleys children's books, saying, oh, I'm now reading I'm a grandmother, and I'm now reading that to my grandchildren. And, so when you write something, it's out there. You never know who. That's another wonderful thing about the written word. It's very powerful. You never know who you might influence. You just don't know. So
And I suppose with your audience too, for people that do think, well, I'm writing in a certain style that I love, and I do think it might appeal to this group. It really might, and then you might get the shock of your life. It actually appeals to a completely different group, and the demographic you thought would be accepting of it don't want anything to do with it. There's a very famous music producer lives in LA, Rick Rubin, who's a complete legend when it comes to music production. Whether you like him or not, or the bands he's produced or not, he produces a very eclectic mix of people. And there was a band, I think they were from LA, called System of a Down, but they sold millions and millions and
yes.
millions of albums. But when they came out, he said the first time he went to see them in a club, playing in a club in LA, he said he couldn't stop laughing, not because they were bad. He said this is the most insane thing he had ever seen, which was a group of mostly they were from Armenian heritage. They were in LA, and their beats were old traditional Armenian folk beats with this crushing thrash metal guitar over the top and a guy screaming his head off. So, I mean, they didn't care what people thought of them. They didn't care what people perceived them as. They were just doing their thing. And again, like it or not, they stayed true to what they believed in. And they went on to become very big and very famous. And when they released their first album, they tried to get it played in all the rock radio stations in and around LA, and they wouldn't touch it. But then as they gigged more and people, word of mouth spread, you got to see these guys. Once the reputation, and then they started writing or phoning the radio stations, then it became their most requested band a year later. But again, they weren't piping to anybody's particular tune. So I think if there's a message to take away from this latter part of this conversation, is it's stay true to yourself. Be focused, be disciplined, don't compromise, don't be afraid to take the path less trodden. How would you sum it up? Because I want to stop it here, and if we're spurred to talk again, you've got a fantastic project, by the way, called Inside Out Writers, and it is a creative writing program for incarcerated youth that I know you've been a big part of in America. And that's something that has great interest to me. So if we do talk again, I want to zone in on that. Okay, we've done a little bit of background on you, done a little bit about the creative process and writing. But if we're spurred next time, I really want to look at this Inside Out Writers program that you have. But to wrap this one up, back into your court, some sage advice for our lovely listeners. What would you tell them to focus on at this time in the world, and in terms of personal happiness and fulfillment? What should they be at?
Keep your eyes open. Stay interested in what is around you, like stay in the real world, what is around you. I want to tell one little last story. When we came back from this particular adventure that we had, we drove across the United States, and we'd been all these different countries in the world and seen all these different types of people. And, the United States was the best country in the world. It's the best. And I was going home, I was going back home. So we're in the South, and we stopped at a gas station, and I went to the drinking fountain. I was so thirsty, and I went to the drinking fountain, and I stopped dead because I looked at the drinking fountain, and there was a sign that said whites only on the drinking fountain. And I stopped, and I said to myself, I was just so shocked. I'd been to all these countries. I'd been behind the Iron Curtain, oppression. And I was coming back to the freest country in the world. And now I saw the sign. What do I do? And I was so thirsty. I thought, is there something I can do? There's nothing I can do. And so I just went and I took a drink out of that fountain. But I felt so empathy, I felt guilty. I felt like I should have done something, but what could I do? And I took that drink, and I went back home, and I went back to my school, and I was not the same person. I was only a kid still, but I was not the same person. And I tried to tell my friends all these adventures, and they just looked at me like, oh, you think you're so great. You think you're different. And I shut up. I realized nobody's interested. Nobody wants to hear what I have to say. They think I'm a liar. I felt like I lived in another world from that point onwards. And I think sometimes we feel like that. And writing for me gave me a chance to tell my story, to be true, and to maybe think that maybe by telling the story, I might open a few other minds of people, to more possibilities and things like that. So that's just, I think I end with that story. Unexpected things happen in your life, like coming upon that drinking fountain. There was nothing I could do in that moment, but I took a drink. But there are things that we can do by initiating, by taking action in our lives. Never going to happen if we just sit there.
Yeah, be proactive. It's not about being, what's the word, able. It's about being available, putting your thoughts and your plans into practice. Karen, we're up to time in this one now. I'm trying my best to keep to the time that we agreed to, because I could talk for a lot longer with you. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day. If you've been listening and enjoying this, please feel free to subscribe to this channel, share this video with whoever you want, like it, do whatever you have to do, hit the notification bell, and in the description box below this, there'll be links through to Karen's Substack page and other channels that she has for her creative output. So please check that out as well. So Karen, big thanks to you. We will talk again, hopefully, about the prison ministry project, the Inside Out Writers creative writing program for incarcerated youth, but that will have to wait for another time. So thank you again. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please make sure you hit the notification bell, because more content will be coming on the way very soon. But as for now, Karen Hunt and Rick Munn are over and out.